It's one of those hidden twists of history that nobody ever warns you about. Picture this. You're a German infantryman in 1941, confident, trained, armed with your trusty carabiner, 98 Kurds. You've drilled endlessly, pulling that bolt back and slamming it forward, shot after shot, and you've been told your rifle is one of the finest in the world. Then, suddenly across the hedge of France or the snowy edges of Belgium, you face an American soldier whose weapon spits out rounds at nearly twice your pace without the pause, without the clunky reloads. That was the M1 Garand, and for Germans, it was like running into an enemy who'd been given a head start in every firefight. The funny part, hardly anyone in the Reich saw it coming. German high command had gambled that bolt-action rifles were good enough. They thought battles would be won by discipline, artillery, and tanks. But the US had quietly handed its infantrymen a semi-automatic rifle that could change the tempo of battle in ways few on the Axis side truly grasped. And this wasn't just a small upgrade. It was a revolution. Let's hype this up for a second because it deserves it. The Garand wasn't some exotic prototype. By 1941, it was the standard issue for American GIS. Think about that. While German soldiers were working their bolts, American soldiers were just squeezing the trigger and firing again. The official manuals put the rate of fire for the M1 Garand around 40 to 50 aim shots per minute. Compare that to the Kar98ks, which in the hands of a skilled shooter could push 15, maybe 20 aimed rounds per minute if the man was quick and steady. That's not a small difference. It's double the firepower in the hands of every regular rifleman. And it didn't just matter on paper. Firefights weren't shooting range demonstrations, they were chaos. Seconds mattered. Cover, movement, and suppression mattered. A Garand-equipped squad could put out such a wall of lead that it overwhelmed defenders who were used to slower and more methodical exchanges. American units found they could push enemies back not just with numbers, but with sheer pressure from continuous fire. Veterans would later say it felt like the Garand gave you confidence because you knew you didn't have to break your rhythm after every shot. But here's the real kicker. The Germans at first didn't even believe it. Reports filtered back about American rifles firing rapidly, but officers often dismissed it as exaggeration or machine guns mixed into the fight. They had underestimated what a mass-issued semi-automatic could do. That's the story we're diving into today. The rifle that General George S. Patton once called the greatest battle implement ever devised, the weapon that gave ordinary American infantrymen an edge against what was supposed to be the most professional army in Europe. By the end of this, you'll see why German soldiers were caught off guard, why their cherished Kar98ks suddenly felt old-fashioned, and how the tempo of World War II's ground battles was rewritten by one firearm that most Germans never truly understood. The story of the Garand begins years before American boots ever touched European soil. In the 1,920 the US Army faced a problem. Its infantry still carried the Springfield M1103, a fine bolt-action rifle, but one that already looked dated in an age when technology was transforming warfare. World War I had shown the importance of rapid firepower. Machine guns had turned trench assaults into slaughterhouses, and even rifles that fired faster could make a decisive difference in close encounters. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. America didn't want to be caught behind again. Enter John Cantius Garand, a Canadian born firearms designer who started working at the Springfield Armory in Massachusetts. By 1932, he had produced a prototype, semi-automatic rifle that captured the Army's imagination. Unlike most of the world's militaries, which clung to tradition, the US dared to think bigger. What if every infantryman had a weapon that could fire as quickly as he could pull the trigger? Not just specialists, not just elite units, everyone. The Garand's design was refined throughout the 1,930 By 1936, the US Army officially adopted the M1 Garand as its standard-issue rifle, replacing the Springfield. This was revolutionary. No other major power would give all of its infantry a semi-automatic rifle as standard equipment. The Soviets would later experiment with the SVT-40, but never in such mass numbers, and the Germans only issued semi-automatics like the G41 and G43 in relatively limited quantities. What made the Garand stand out wasn't just its semi-automatic action. It fed from an 8-round clip, which popped out with a famous ping once empty. Reloading was fast. Slam another clip in and you were ready to go. By contrast, the Kar98ks relied on 5-round stripper clips and a bolt that demanded manual cycling after every shot. That difference added up in combat, but getting the M1 Garand into the hands of every soldier wasn't simple. The Great Depression had gutted military budgets, and in the late 1932s, isolationist America wasn't eager to pour money into mass rearmament. Yet the army stuck to its decision, slowly building production capacity at Springfield Armory and later at Winchester. By 1941, just months before Pearl Harbor, around 50,000 rifles had been produced. It wasn't nearly enough, but the groundwork had been laid for the massive wartime ramp-up to come. When Japanese planes bombed Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, America's entry into the war accelerated everything. The Army's foresight in adopting a semi-automatic rifle years earlier suddenly paid off. While most of the world's infantry marched into battle with designs rooted in the late 19th century, the American GI carried a rifle that looked like something from the future. German officers, when they first encountered reports of this weapon in North Africa in 1942, couldn't believe that ordinary American infantry had such firepower. Some assumed it must have been a light machine gun, but it wasn't. It was just Private Smith, or Corporal Jones, with his M1 Garand, a weapon born out of a vision from the 1932s that no one else had dared to pursue so boldly. This foresight didn't just shape tactics, it shaped morale. American soldiers, especially those who had trained with older bolt-action rifles, felt like they had been handed a gift. They could shoot faster, reload faster, and keep an enemy's head down longer. In a war where seconds often decided who lived and who died, the Garand's birth marked the beginning of an American edge that would only grow stronger as the war dragged on. Across the Atlantic, the German army had made a very different bet. The Carabiner 98K, better known as the Kar98ks, was officially adopted in 1935, just 1 year before the Americans finalized the Garand. But unlike the semi-automatic leap taken by the US, the Germans doubled down on the tried-and-true bolt-action rifle. Why? Because German military thinking valued precision, durability, and tradition. The Kar98ks itself was a shortened, modernized version of the Gar-98 that had served the Kaiser's armies during World War I. By trimming the barrel and making the design slightly more manageable, the Kar98ks became the standard German rifle of World War II. Soldiers were drilled to work the bolt fluidly, almost as if it were second nature. And it was accurate. Exceptionally accurate. In the hands of a trained marksman, the Kar98ks could hit targets hundreds of yards away with deadly consistency. German doctrine emphasized marksmanship over volume. They believed infantry firepower would be supplemented by machine guns like the MG34 and later the MG42, which truly did dominate battlefields with their incredible rates of fire. The individual soldier, armed with his Kar98ks, was expected to provide steady, precise fire, while squads relied on their machine gun as the centerpiece of combat. From this perspective, giving everyone a semi-automatic rifle seemed unnecessary, almost wasteful. But this decision created blind spots. While the Kar98ks was an excellent rifle in controlled conditions, it was slower. Every shot required lifting, pulling, pushing, and resetting the bolt before squeezing the trigger again. German soldiers could usually manage 10 to 15 aimed shots per minute. By contrast, an American with a Garand could fire 30 or more without breaking rhythm. To be fair, the Germans did experiment with semi-automatics. By 1941, designs like the G41W from Walther and later the G43 were tested and even issued in limited numbers, particularly on the Eastern Front, where the Red Army's semi-automatic SVT-40 rifles caught their attention. But production problems, shortages of materials, and the complexity of these rifles meant they never reached the scale of the American program. The Kar98k remained the backbone of the German infantry until the war's end. Another critical factor was industrial mindset. Germany's leadership in the 1932nd focused its resources heavily on tanks, artillery, and the Luftwaffe. Rifles were seen as a settled matter. Bolt actions had worked in the last war, so why change? The Wehrmacht's confidence in its machine gun-centric doctrine also meant that rifles didn't need to fire faster. That thinking would come back to haunt them when they realized that a squad of American riflemen could, in some scenarios, put out nearly as much suppressive fire as a German light machine gun. For German soldiers on the ground, the Kar98k was a trusted companion. It was rugged, reliable, and lethal in the right hands. But as battles intensified, particularly after 1942, those same soldiers began noticing the difference. Firefights against American units weren't evenly paced duels. They were barges with bullets coming faster than expected. And while German doctrine said, "Trust your machine gun," not every squad had an MG in the perfect spot when the firefight started. That's when the cracks in the Kar98k gamble showed most clearly. The Germans had walked into World War II with a rifle designed for an earlier era. They didn't realize that their enemy had already stepped into the next one. So, what exactly made the Garand so much faster than the Kar98k? On paper, both were rifles that fired a single bullet with each pull of the trigger. But the difference lay in the mechanics. The Kar98k was bolt action, meaning that after every shot, the soldier had to lift the bolt handle, pull it back to eject the spent cartridge, push it forward to chamber a new round, and then lock it back down. It was a rhythm drilled into German soldiers until it was automatic, but it still cost precious seconds with every shot. The M1 Garand, by contrast, was semi-automatic. Its gas-operated system used some of the energy from the fired round to cycle the action automatically. That meant the shooter's only job was to keep pulling the trigger. Fire a round, the rifle ejects the casing, loads the next one, and is ready instantly. No bolt to manipulate, no extra motions, just squeeze and fire again. This translated into raw numbers that made all the difference. A skilled American GI could easily put out 40 to 50 aimed shots per minute. Even an average soldier could manage 30 without strain. With the Kar98k, 15 was more realistic, 20 if you were very fast. That's at least twice the firepower per soldier. Multiply that by a full squad of 10 or 12 riflemen, and suddenly you have an American unit throwing down what looked like machine gun levels of fire compared to their German counterparts. Another key was the Garand's 8-round en-bloc clip. Unlike the Kar98k's 5-round stripper clips, the Garand allowed soldiers to reload in one swift motion. Shove the clip down into the magazine, and you're back in action. The famous metallic ping, as the clip ejected, wasn't just iconic. It was the sound of a rifle that never stayed empty for long. German soldiers, stuck reloading more often and working bolts in between, simply couldn't keep up with that rhythm. It's important to understand how this played out in real combat. In small unit firefights, suppression was everything. If you could keep the enemy's head down, you could maneuver, flank, or break contact. The Garand allowed Americans to sustain that suppressive fire without pausing to cycle bolts or reload constantly. German squads relied heavily on their MG-34 or MG-42 to fill that role, but when the machine gun wasn't set up or if it was knocked out, suddenly the imbalance between rifles became painfully obvious. Even more interesting, studies after the war showed that soldiers under stress often didn't take careful aim for every shot. They fired rapidly, instinctively. In that environment, a rifle that could keep shooting without interruption wasn't just more efficient, it was psychologically overwhelming. German troops who expected a duel of paced shots instead faced a torrent of fire that seemed endless. And here's a subtle detail: fatigue. Working a bolt-action rifle over hours of combat wore down a soldier's arm and concentration. The Garand semi-automatic action eased that burden. Soldiers could focus more on aiming and moving rather than manipulating their weapon. Over a long battle, that saved energy and increased effectiveness. When you stack these factors together, the automatic cycling, the faster reloads, the doubled rate of fire, and the reduced fatigue, it becomes clear why the Garand was not just a better rifle, but a technological leap. It was the first time in history that a major army gave all of its infantry a rifle that effectively doubled their individual firepower. And the Germans never fully caught up. The first time German troops truly grasped the difference wasn't in manuals or captured weapons. It was on the battlefield. When American forces landed in North Africa in November 1942 during Operation Torch, Axis soldiers faced an opponent armed almost entirely with M1 Garands. For German units accustomed to trading fire with British troops, still carrying bolt-action Lee Enfields, the tempo of combat suddenly felt different. Reports described firefights where American rifle squads seemed to deliver uninterrupted fire, something German officers initially misattributed to hidden machine guns. By the time of the Sicily campaign in 1943, those reports had become harder to dismiss. German defenders noticed that even when they knocked out a squad's machine gunner, the Americans didn't lose their volume of fire. Ordinary riflemen were laying down suppressive fire at a rate that outpaced expectations. One German diary entry from the period described being pinned by rifles that fired as though they were automatics. In Italy, the same shock repeated. The mountainous terrain made every firefight brutal and close. Here, the Garands' advantage really showed. American squads could push uphill or across open ground with more confidence because their riflemen didn't need to pause after every shot. Veterans remembered that it felt like they could keep the enemy's head in the dirt, while German units stuck with bolt actions had to rely even more desperately on their MG-34S and MG-42S to even the odds. Then came Normandy in June 1944. German defenders in the Bocage country of France encountered mass American rifle fire unlike anything they'd faced before. One German officer wrote in an after-action report that US infantry seemed to have many more machine guns than they carried. In reality, it was simply squads of grand-armed soldiers firing as fast as they could pull the trigger. That rapid tempo often disoriented defenders who had trained for slower, measured exchanges. The surprise didn't stop at the beaches. During the push into France and Belgium, firefights in villages revealed just how much initiative the Garand gave American soldiers. If a German soldier poked his head out to aim with his Kar98ks, he risked being hit by 2 or 3 Garand rounds before he could even cycle his bolt for a follow-up. That wasn't a small tactical detail. It changed the way entire engagements unfolded. Even on the Eastern Front, where semi-automatics like the Soviet SVT-40 existed, German troops noted the difference when transferred west. Against the Red Army, semi-automatics were scattered and less reliable. Against Americans, everyone had one. The shock was systemic, and it wasn't just speed that stunned the Germans. It was confidence. GIS with Garands often advanced aggressively, firing rapidly as they moved. German soldiers called it reckless, but in reality it was calculated. The Garand gave them the ability to dominate in close-range engagements. That confidence fed morale, while German infantry increasingly felt they were at a disadvantage unless their machine guns were perfectly placed. By 1945, German officers openly admitted that American infantry firepower, driven largely by the M1 Garand, was a major challenge. Some tried to respond by rushing more G43 rifles into service, but it was too late. The shock that had begun in North Africa never truly faded. The Wehrmacht had underestimated what doubling rifle firepower meant, and the battlefield itself delivered the lesson. What often gets overlooked is how the Garand didn't just change the math of bullets per minute, it changed the psychology of battle. Imagine you're crouched behind a stone wall in Normandy, Kar98ks in hand. You've been trained to fire with precision, to squeeze off a shot, and then work the bolt with practice speed. But the moment you expose yourself, the air fills with half a dozen Garand rounds, zipping past your head. Not 1 or 2 carefully aimed shots, an avalanche of fire. That experience rattled even hardened German veterans. American squads quickly realized they could fight more aggressively. The semi-automatic action gave them the confidence to push forward while firing, knowing they didn't have to pause to cycle a bolt. That confidence wasn't misplaced. German accounts repeatedly mentioned being overwhelmed by the uninterrupted fire of enemy rifles. Suppression, which had once required a machine gun, could now be achieved by a line of ordinary riflemen. This dynamic played out in squad tactics. A U.S. infantry squad typically had 12 men, each armed with a Garand plus a Browning automatic rifle bar for extra punch. Compare that to a German squad of roughly 10 centered around its MG-34 or MG-42 with riflemen supporting. In theory, the German system made sense. Put all your power into one machine gun and let the rifleman protect it. In practice, if the MG was neutralized, or if the Americans attacked from multiple angles, the Garand squad had far more flexibility. Every man was in effect a miniature fire support weapon. The psychological edge ran deeper than tactics. Soldiers talked about how the Garand felt like a lifeline. Veterans of the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 recalled how, in the freezing Ardennes forests, their rifle gave them confidence even when outnumbered. One veteran said plainly, "With the Garand, you felt like you had a chance." That morale mattered in ways that statistics couldn't measure. Even small details worked in the Americ's favor. The famous metallic ping when the Garand ejected an empty clip became part of battlefield lore. Germans sometimes claimed they could exploit it. Hearing the ping meant the rifle was empty, but in the chaos of battle with dozens of Garands firing, that sound blended into the background. What really stood out to German soldiers wasn't the ping, but the relentless rhythm of fire that never seemed to stop. It also changed how combat felt over time. Firing a bolt action for hours wore you down physically, working the bolt, reloading more often. It taxed your body and slowed your reflexes. The Garand reduced that strain. Soldiers could fight longer, stay sharper, and focus more on maneuver and teamwork rather than the mechanics of their weapon. On the flip side, German morale sometimes took hits when they realized they were facing opponents whose ordinary soldiers were armed better than their own. Captured prisoners occasionally remarked with surprise at the grand speed, admitting they had initially assumed Americans were using submachine guns or hidden automatics. That kind of surprise sowed doubt in the ranks, which in war could be just as dangerous as bullets. In the end, the Garand gave Americans not just a mechanical edge, but a mental one. It helped create squads that were faster, more confident, and more adaptable, qualities that combined with industrial might made the U.S. infantry one of the most formidable forces of the war. Behind the grand success wasn't just brilliant design. It was America's industrial machine. Having a semi-automatic rifle was one thing, but putting it into the hands of millions of soldiers required a level of production that few nations could dream of. By the time the war ended in 1945, over 4 million M1 Garands had been manufactured, an astonishing figure that dwarfed German attempts to field semi-automatics like the G41 or G43. The story of that mass production began at the Springfield Armory where John Garand worked. By the late 1932s, Springfield had developed the expertise to produce the rifle at scale. But when the US entered the war in December 1941, demand exploded. Contracts went out to other companies, most notably Winchester, to ramp up numbers. Assembly lines operated day and night with workers, many of them women, stepping into industrial jobs for the first time, turning out rifles by the thousands. This was the same American industrial engine that built Liberty ships in weeks and turned out thousands of tanks and aircraft. The Garand was just one part of a larger miracle of production. The War Department understood that equipping every infantryman with a semi-automatic required a staggering supply of steel, wood, and labor. And yet, unlike Germany, which struggled with shortages and Allied bombing campaigns, the US had secure resources and unbombed factories. That security allowed for consistency. Rifles could be made, inspected, and shipped without catastrophic interruption. By 1943, American production had reached a peak. Hundreds of thousands of rifles rolled off the lines each year. Training camps across the US became filled with the rhythmic crack of semi-automatic fire as new recruits learned to handle their Garands. When they shipped out, they carried a weapon that looked and felt identical to the one issued to their buddies, a standardization that made logistics far simpler. Ammunition, clips, spare parts, all were uniform, all mass-produced. Germany, meanwhile, struggled to field anything comparable. Their G41W proved unreliable, often jamming in dirty conditions, and their later G43 was better, but came too late, and in too few numbers. Fewer than 500,000 were ever made. In a war where millions of men needed rifles, the Germans simply couldn't match American scale. Most of their troops fought the entire war with bolt-action Kar98ks, while their semi-automatics remained a rare sight. The impact of this production scale was enormous. In campaigns from Italy to France, virtually every American rifleman carried a Garand. This meant that when divisions hit the beaches at Normandy or crossed the Rhine into Germany, they did so with a level of individual firepower that no Axis force could consistently match. Mass production had turned a clever invention into a battlefield standard. Even logistics officers marveled at the efficiency. Ammunition factories pumped out 3,006 cartridges by the billions. Wooden crates of en-bloc clips arrived at the front in endless supply. Soldiers joked that America's factories were as important to victory as its generals. And in many ways, they weren't wrong. A Garand in every hand was possible only because industry back home had risen to the challenge. When German prisoners saw not just one or two semi-automatics, but entire companies armed with them, the shock doubled. This wasn't an elite weapon. It was an everyman's rifle backed by a nation that had turned industrial might into battlefield dominance. By the end of the war, the M1 Garand wasn't just a weapon. It was a symbol. American GIs swore by it, calling it dependable, powerful, and above all, fast. General George S. Patton's famous praise of the rifle as the greatest battle implement ever devised wasn't hyperbole. It reflected how the Garand had reshaped infantry combat. Veterans carried those memories for the rest of their lives, often crediting the rifle with giving them the confidence to survive firefights that might otherwise have been fatal. Its legacy extended beyond the war's final battles. After Germany's surrender in May 1945 and Japan's in September, the Garand remained in service for decades. It saw action in Korea from 1950 to 1953, where once again it proved its worth against Chinese and North Korean forces, still heavily armed with bolt-actions and submachine guns. Even into the early years of Vietnam, the Garand was still carried by some Allied forces. But what made the Garand's World War II legacy so profound wasn't just longevity. It was the contrast it created. The Germans had fought an entire war relying primarily on a rifle design rooted in the late 19th century. The Americans had armed millions with a semi-automatic that gave them a massive edge in firepower. That disparity forced every military in the world to rethink what standard issue meant. By the 1950 seconds, semi-automatics became the global norm, and by the 1960 seconds, fully automatic assault rifles like the M16 and AK-47 were setting the new standard. The Garand was the bridge that made that leap inevitable. The memory lingered. Post-war memoirs sometimes mentioned the shock of facing Americans whose rifles seemed to fire without pause. Some admitted that they initially thought they were under attack by hidden machine gunners. That kind of impression sticks. It meant that the Garand wasn't just winning firefights. It was shaping how the enemy perceived the battlefield itself. In America, the rifle became a point of pride. Soldiers brought them home, and they became icons in films, museums, and military ceremonies. Even today, when reenactors march in parades or veterans honor guards fire salutes, it's often with Garands. That wooden stock, that metallic ping, that steady thump of 30E6 rounds. It's more than just nostalgia. It's recognition of a weapon that gave ordinary men an extraordinary advantage. Looking back, it's remarkable how much one decision in the 1930 seconds reshaped history. By daring to abandon bolt actions and invest in a semi-automatic standard rifle, the US Army gave its infantry a decisive edge that echoed across every major campaign of World War II. The Germans never truly adapted, and their soldiers never forgot the shock of facing it. The Garand story is a reminder of how technology, industry, and foresight can alter the course of war. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't exotic, but it doubled the firepower of every man who carried it. And for the Germans who faced it, that advantage was one they never saw coming and one they could never fully match. The laughter didn't last long. In the early months of 1943, when American forces were still finding their footing in North Africa, German veterans dismissed reports about the Garand with knowing smirks. Propaganda posters back in Berlin mocked American soldiers as soft, unprepared farm boys playing at war. The idea that their rifles could outmatch German precision seemed laughable. But then came Tunisia. At places like Kasserine Pass, American troops took brutal losses, but not because their rifles failed them. They were learning the hard way about combined arms warfare, about coordination and tactics, and in those chaotic engagements, even as the Wehrmacht pushed them back, German squad leaders started noticing something unsettling. The volume of fire coming from American positions was relentless, unnaturally sustained. After action, reports from German officers began mentioning it more frequently. One Feldwebel wrote in his diary that he initially thought his unit was facing a company-sized element, only to discover it was a single American platoon. The rifle fire was so continuous that it created the preparing and narrating. This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The illusion of overwhelming numbers. That wasn't tactics. That was the Garand doing exactly what it was designed to do. By the time the Allies invaded Sicily in July 1943, the skepticism had evaporated. German defenders dug into hillside positions, found themselves suppressed by American riflemen who could keep their heads down with accuracy and speed. In one engagement near Gela, a Panzer Grenadier unit reported being pinned by what they estimated were 2 machine gun nests. When they finally withdrew, they discovered the fire had come from just 8 GIs with Garands, spread across a ridgeline. This wasn't about marksmanship anymore. It was about tempo. The Germans had built their infantry doctrine around the MG-42, a belt-fed monster that could spit out 1,200 rounds per minute. Their riflemen were supposed to support that weapon, not be the primary source of firepower. But the Americans had inverted the model. Every man was a source of sustained fire. The squad automatic weapon, the BAR, added to that base rather than carrying it alone. The psychological impact of this started to show in intercepted radio chatter and prisoner interrogations. German soldiers admitted they felt outgunned at the individual level, something that had rarely happened against Soviet or British infantry. The Red Army had numbers but often inferior weapons. The British had excellent training but carried the Lee Enfield, still a bolt action. The Americans had both quality and a force multiplier in every soldier's hands. Then came the Italian campaign, and things got worse for the Wehrmacht. In the mountains around Monte Cassino and along the Gothic line, American infantrymen used their Garands to devastating effect in close-quarters combat. German positions that would have held against bolt-action-equipped forces found themselves overwhelmed. The Americans could advance under their own covering fire, something that required careful coordination with machine guns in most armies. One German lieutenant, captured near Anzio, told his interrogators that fighting Americans felt like facing an entire squad of sharpshooters who never needed to pause. He said his men had started to dread the sound of Garand fire, that distinctive crack that seemed to multiply across the battlefield. It wasn't fear of a single bullet, it was fear of the next 7 that would follow without hesitation. But here's where the story takes an interesting turn. The Germans weren't ignorant of semi-automatic rifle technology. They had their own designs. The Gewehr 41, introduced in 1941, was supposed to be their answer, but it was a disaster. The rifle was heavy, unreliable, and prone to jamming in the dust and mud of the Eastern Front. Troops hated it. By 1943, most G41s had been pulled from frontline service or relegated to rear echelon units. The Gewehr 43 came next, a much improved design that actually worked. It was lighter, more reliable, and used a detachable magazine instead of the clumsy loading system of the G41. German soldiers who got their hands on a G43 praised it. Finally, they had something that could match the Garand's rate of fire. But there was a catastrophic problem. production numbers. While Americans were cranking out hundreds of thousands of Garands every year, the Germans managed to produce fewer than 400,000 G43s during the entire war. Most of those went to the Eastern Front, where the need was most desperate. Western Front units, facing the Americans and British, rarely saw them. The average Lancer in Normandy, or the Bulge, was still working his Kar98k bolt, while watching his enemies empty 8-round clips without breaking stride. This production failure wasn't just about industrial capacity, though that was part of it. Germany's war economy was stretched impossibly thin by 1943. Resources went to tanks, aircraft, and the voracious demands of the Eastern Front. Rifles, even game-changing ones, were lower priority. The decision to stick with bolt actions as the standard until late in the war became a strategic anchor. When D-Day arrived on June 6, 1944, the disparity became undeniable. American troops storming Omaha Beach faced withering fire, but those who made it off the sand found that once they closed distance with German positions, their Garands gave them a crucial edge. In the hedgerows of Normandy, where combat was intimate and brutal, the ability to fire rapidly without cycling a bolt meant the difference between life and death. German veterans of the Normandy campaign later described the experience as fighting an opponent who had a half-second advantage in every exchange. That doesn't sound like much until you realize that in close combat, a half-second is an eternity. It's the gap between getting your shot off first or taking a round before you can react. Multiply that across thousands of engagements, and you see how the Garand helped tip the scales. The autumn of 1944 brought even clearer examples. During Operation Market Garden and the fighting in the Hurtgen Forest, American rifle companies found themselves in grinding, attritional battles. The Germans fought with desperate skill, but their individual soldiers were at a firepower disadvantage that no amount of training could overcome. A German squad might have 1 or 2 soldiers with MP-40 submachine guns, a machine gun team, and the rest with Kar98ks. An American squad had 8 men with Garands, a BAR gunner, and maybe a Thompson or grease gun for the squad leader. The mathematics of violence favored the Americans in almost every rifle-on-rifle exchange, and the Germans knew it. Morale reports from Wehrmacht units in late 1944 reflected growing pessimism. Soldiers were exhausted, undersupplied, and increasingly aware they were facing enemies with better equipment. The Garand wasn't the only factor, but it was one they could see, hear, and feel in every firefight. By the time the Battle of the Bulge erupted in December 1944, the Wehrmacht's last major offensive in the West, German soldiers were no longer laughing at American rifles. They were trying to capture them. Battlefield scavenging reports show that German troops frequently picked up abandoned or captured Garands and used them in preference to their own weapons. American ammunition was plentiful on battlefields where supply lines crossed, and a Garand in German hands was still a Garand. But the real story wasn't just about firepower. It was about what that firepower enabled. American infantry could be more aggressive because they had confidence in their weapons. They could suppress enemies more effectively, maneuver more boldly, and take risks that would have been suicidal with slower rifles. Doctrine and tactics evolved around what the Garand made possible. German tactical manuals from early in the war emphasized careful fire discipline and marksmanship. American manuals, especially as the war went on, emphasized speed and volume. Training instructors taught GIs to fire fast and reload faster. The famous Garand thumb, the painful pinch soldiers got if they didn't keep their thumb clear while loading, became a rite of passage. It was worth the occasional bruise for the advantage the rifle provided. The endgame of the European war saw the final vindication of the Garand's design. As American forces crossed the Rhine and pushed into Germany itself, they faced increasingly desperate resistance. Volkssturm units, old men and boys, were handed Kar98ks with minimal training. Hitler Youth clutched Panzerfausts in last-ditch ambushes. Against this crumbling defense, American infantry with their Garands were a relentless professional force. The contrast couldn't have been starker. On one side, an army that had started the war as the most modern and professional in Europe, now reduced to using weapons from the previous generation and conscripting children. On the other, an army that had entered the war late but came equipped with the tools of the future. The Garand was the most visible symbol of that technological and industrial gap. When Berlin fell and the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the legacy was clear. The Wehrmacht had underestimated the M1 Garand from the start, dismissed it as American excess, and paid the price in every engagement where rifles mattered. They had laughed at the idea that fire rate could matter more than precision, but combat had proven them wrong. The Americans hadn't just built a better rifle, they had reimagined what an infantryman could be, not a marksman supporting a machine gun, but a mobile source of firepower in his own right. That philosophy, enabled by the Garand, would shape military thinking for generations. The age of the bolt action was over, killed by 8 rounds of semi-automatic fire, one ping at a time. And the Germans, who had once mocked the Garand as a curiosity, learned the hardest lesson of modern war. In industrial age combat, the side that arms every soldier with the best tools usually wins. The Wehrmacht had skill, courage, and tactical prowess. But in the end, the GI with his Garand had something more valuable: 3 times the firepower and the confidence to use it. The real measure of the Garand's impact wasn't just in the battles it won, but in the conversations it ended. After the war, when military historians and weapons experts from around the world examined what had happened, the debate about semi-automatic rifles was settled. The Germans had bet on tradition, the Americans had bet on innovation, and the battlefield had rendered its verdict with brutal clarity. Soviet observers, who had attended the Tehran and Yalta conferences and witnessed American forces in action during the link-up at the Elbe, took careful notes. The Red Army had experimented with the SVT-38 and SVT-40 semi-automatic rifles of their own design. But production problems, reliability issues in harsh conditions, and the desperate circumstances of 1941 and 1942 had forced them to prioritize the simpler, cheaper Mosin Nagant bolt action and the PPS-41 submachine gun. After seeing what the Americans accomplished with universal semi-automatic issue, Soviet military planners began rethinking their approach. The lessons wouldn't fully materialize until the AK-47 appeared in 1947, but the seed was planted. If the Americans could arm every rifleman with a semi-automatic and dominate at medium range, perhaps the future lay in giving every soldier a selective fire weapon that could do even more. The British, too, had taken notice. Throughout the war, they had relied on the Lee Enfield, a bolt action that was arguably the fastest of its kind in trained hands. A skilled British soldier could fire 20 to 30 aimed rounds per minute with the Lee Enfield's smooth action and 10-round magazine, but even that impressive rate couldn't match the Garand's effortless semi-automatic fire. British after-action reports from combined operations with American forces repeatedly mentioned the firepower disparity. By 1947, the British were developing the EM2, a bullpup rifle that fired an intermediate cartridge, looking ahead to what would eventually become the SA-80. The Garand had shown them that the future belonged to self-loading rifles, even if Britain would take decades to fully transition away from bolt actions in reserve and Commonwealth forces. But let's go deeper into what made the Garand's advantage so pronounced in actual combat conditions. It wasn't just about raw rate of fire. It was about how that speed changed the geometry of firefights. Consider a typical engagement at 200 yards, a common fighting distance in the European theatre. A German soldier with a Kar98ks had to perform several distinct actions for each shot: acquire target, aim, fire, work the bolt back, eject the spent casing, chamber a new round, close the bolt, reacquire the target, aim again, and fire. Each cycle took between 3 and 4 seconds for a well-trained soldier under stress. That's 15 to 20 shots per minute, as we've established. But here's the critical part. During that bolt manipulation, the German soldier's sight picture was disrupted. He had to take his cheek off the stock, break his aim, work the mechanism, and then re-establish everything. Those fractions of a second added up, and they created windows of vulnerability. An American with a Garand simply aimed and squeezed the trigger repeatedly. His sight picture remained largely undisturbed. The rifle's gas-operated action cycled automatically. The recoil was manageable. He could keep his target in view and adjust for movement without the mechanical interruption of a bolt. This meant not only faster fire, but more accurate follow-up shots. The first round might miss, but the second, third, and fourth were already on the way while the target was still in the same general position. In practical terms, this meant that in the time it took a German soldier to fire 3 carefully aimed shots, an American could fire 6 to 8, and several of those would be accurate. The mathematics weren't just about quantity. They were about the probability of hits. More rounds downrange, with less disruption between shots, meant more enemy casualties and more effective suppression. Suppression itself became a key factor. Military psychologists who studied combat effectiveness after the war found that soldiers under fire spent more time seeking cover and less time shooting back. The intensity and continuity of fire mattered enormously. A single shot every 4 seconds was threatening. 2 shots per second from the same position was overwhelming. It changed the calculation for anyone trying to return fire or maneuver. German squad tactics had been built around the MG-34 and MG-42, providing that suppressive effect, while riflemen provided accurate supporting fire. But American squads, with every rifleman capable of rapid fire, could suppress effectively, even without their machine gun in action. This gave American infantry a flexibility that German units lacked. If the BAR gunner went down, the squad was still dangerous. If a German MG-42 team was knocked out, the squad's firepower dropped dramatically. There were also secondary effects that rarely make it into the history books. Ammunition consumption is one. Yes, the Garand encouraged higher rates of fire, which meant soldiers went through ammunition faster, but American logistics were so robust that this was never a critical problem. Ammunition came ashore at Normandy by the ton, was trucked forward in endless convoys, and was distributed down to the squad level with remarkable efficiency. Germany, by contrast, struggled with logistics throughout the war, especially after 1943. Ammunition shortages were common, particularly on the Eastern Front. But even in the West, German units often had to ration their fire carefully. This created a vicious cycle. They had slower rifles that required more precise shooting to be effective, and they often lacked the ammunition to practice or to sustain heavy firefights. Meanwhile, Americans could afford to be generous with their trigger pulls because the supply chain backed them up. Training was another factor. American boot camps in 1943 and 1944 could put thousands of recruits through rifle qualification courses with Garands, expending enormous quantities of ammunition to build familiarity and confidence. By the time a soldier shipped overseas, he had fired hundreds, sometimes thousands of rounds through his weapon. He knew its quirks, its reload rhythm, its effective range. German training by the same period had been compressed and degraded by the demands of a multi-front war. New replacements often arrived at the front with minimal rifle training, having fired perhaps a few dozen rounds in practice. They were handed Kar98ks and expected to learn on the job. The weapon itself was simple and reliable, but mastery took time they often didn't have. The Garand, being semi-automatic, was arguably more forgiving of inexperience. A nervous soldier could still put rounds on target quickly, even if his technique wasn't perfect. Then there's the matter of morale and psychological warfare. Soldiers talk, stories spread. By 1944, it was common knowledge among German troops that American infantry had superior rifles. This wasn't propaganda. It was lived experience, shared in letters home, in conversations in aid stations, in the bitter jokes of men who had survived firefights. That knowledge created a subtle but real psychological disadvantage. When you know the enemy has better equipment, it affects your willingness to take risks. German soldiers in 1944 and 1945 were often in defensive positions, which should have given them an advantage. But the knowledge that American riflemen could pour out fire at 3 times their rate made aggressive counterattacks or bold maneuvers less appealing. Why expose yourself when you know you'll be outgunned at the individual level? American soldiers, conversely, grew more confident as the war went on. They trusted their Garands. Veteran infantry units developed a swagger that came from knowing they had an edge in small arms. This confidence translated into aggressiveness, faster advances, and a willingness to close with the enemy. In military terms, this is called offensive spirit, and it's often the difference between armies that win and armies that merely survive. There's a specific incident worth highlighting that encapsulates the Garands' impact. During the Battle of the Bulge, near the town of Bastogne, a company of the 101st Airborne held a critical crossroads against repeated German attacks. They were surrounded, low on ammunition, and facing elements of the 2nd Panzer Division. In one engagement, a single platoon of American paratroopers, armed with Garands and a couple of BARs, held off an assault by a much larger German force. The German after-action report from that engagement, discovered in archives years later, noted that the American position generated such heavy rifle fire that the attacking force assumed they were facing a reinforced company with multiple machine guns. When they finally withdrew and counted their casualties against the expected enemy strength, they realized they had been stopped by fewer than 40 men. The report specifically mentioned the rapid-fire rifles as a decisive factor. Stories like that weren't anomalies. They were repeated across the entire front, in Italy, France, Belgium, and Germany itself. Every time German forces encountered American infantry in situations where rifles mattered, the pattern held. The side with semi-automatics won the firefight more often than not, casualties being equal, and when combined with American artillery, air support, and armour, the infantry's edge with the Garand became part of a combined arms system that the Germans simply couldn't counter. It's worth asking why the Germans never managed to adapt more effectively. Part of it was institutional. The Wehrmacht's officer corps was conservative in some ways, progressive in others. They had pioneered armoured warfare and close air support, but they remained wedded to the idea that infantry excellence came from discipline and marksmanship, not from technology. This wasn't stupidity. It was a different philosophy of war, but another part was simply resource allocation. By 1943, Germany was fighting a losing war on multiple fronts. Every decision involved triage: jets or rifles, tanks or semi-automatics, 2 rockets or infantry equipment. The choices were impossible, and they usually went toward the more dramatic, prestigious projects. The G-43 program got funding, but never the priority it needed to become universal. There's also a counterfactual worth considering. What if Germany had invested in semi-automatic rifles in the 1,930 seconds, the way America did? What if every German soldier at the start of Barbarossa in 1941 had carried a reliable semi-automatic instead of a Kar98ks? The Eastern Front might have looked very different. Soviet infantry in 1941 were often poorly equipped and trained. A German army with 3 times the individual firepower might have been unstoppable in the opening months. But they didn't make that choice, and by the time they realized the error, it was too late. American industrial might and Soviet manpower were already turning the tide. The Garand was one piece of a larger puzzle, but it was a piece that fit perfectly into the American way of war. Technologically advanced, industrially produced, and tactically flexible. As the war ended and soldiers came home, the Garand came with them, both literally and figuratively. It showed up in newsreels, in victory parades, in the hands of honor guards. It became a symbol of American military prowess, as iconic as the Sherman tank or the B-17 bomber. And unlike those vehicles, soldiers had a personal relationship with their Garands. They had carried them, cleaned them, trusted them with their lives. The Wehrmacht had laughed at the M1 Garand because they didn't understand what it represented. It wasn't just a rifle. It was a statement about the future of infantry combat, about the importance of giving individual soldiers maximum capability, about the marriage of industrial capacity and tactical innovation. By the time they stopped laughing, the war was already lost.